Rome called itself eternal. Marble temples rose toward the sky, banners snapped in the wind, and the crowds cheered as if the gods themselves lived among them. But beneath the empire, far below the stones and triumphs, there were chains. They did not sing of this Rome. In the mines where daylight never reached, men worked until their hands bled into the rock. In the farms, backs bent under whips, not years. In the gladiator schools, bodies were trained not to live, but to die beautifully. These were not citizens. They were offerings. At night, when the guards slept and the torches burned low, the slaves whispered, not prayers to Jupiter, not to Mars. Those gods belonged to Rome. They whispered older names. Names the empire had buried. Long before Rome crowned its emperors, there were gods who demanded no temples, only obedience. Gods who did not promise mercy, only power. Their symbols were scratched into stone walls, hidden beneath straw, carved into flesh where no overseer would look. Circles broken by claws. Eyes without faces. Chains wrapped around empty thrones. Some said these were just stories to comfort the broken. Others said the stories were warnings. In the depths of the gladiator barracks, there were men who survived wounds that should have killed them. Fighters who stood after their bones snapped. Slaves who claimed they heard voices during battle. Voices that spoke not in Latin but in something older, colder. Rome pretended not to notice, but the signs were there. Animals refused to enter certain tunnels. Fires died without reason. And sometimes, just before dawn, a guard would vanish, leaving behind nothing but a symbol burned into the ground, black as pitch. The empire called it superstition. The slaves called it hope. And somewhere beneath Rome's feet, in the dark where chains never slept, something ancient stirred, listening, waiting. Because empires are not destroyed from above. They break from the chains beneath them. Rome ruled by law, by steel, and by fear. But there was one thing Rome feared more than rebellion: belief. Because armies can be crushed, men can be executed, but beliefs, once planted, do not die easily. Long before Rome became an empire, before its legions marched beneath golden eagles, the lands it would one day conquer already belonged to other gods. Older gods. Gods without names carved in marble. Gods who did not ask for temples or praise, only remembrance. When Rome expanded, it did what it always did. It absorbed what it could. Renamed foreign gods. Declared them cousins of Jupiter or Mars. Those that could not be controlled were erased. Their priests disappeared. Their shrines burned. Their stories rewritten into warnings. Officially, Rome claimed these gods never existed. Unofficially, Rome hunted those who still remembered. Among the slaves, men and women torn from conquered worlds, the memory survived. In chains, belief becomes sharper. Pain strips away doubt. And in suffering, the old gods found fertile ground. The cult had no single origin. It spread wherever Rome broke people. In the depths of mines where screams were swallowed by stone. In the bellies of slave ships where prayer turned to madness. Beneath gladiator schools where blood fed the sand day after day. It had no leader, no scripture, no true name. Rome called it a plague. The slaves called it the path beneath. Initiation was never offered. It was endured. A chosen slave would vanish at night, taken by others through tunnels known only to those who cleaned latrines or hauled bodies away. No torches were lit. Darkness was part of the test. Words were spoken, not in Latin, not in Greek, but in a broken ancient tongue that scraped the mind like stone on bone. They said the gods listened best in the dark. Some initiates claimed they felt hands where none existed. Others spoke of whispers crawling inside their skulls, promising strength, endurance, vengeance. Many did not return. Those who did were changed. They healed faster. They endured more pain. They smiled while being whipped. In the arena, they fought like men who had already died and were no longer afraid. They marked themselves carefully, not with symbols Rome could recognize. A scar hidden beneath the arm, a pattern cut into the sole of the foot, marks that said, "I remember." Rome noticed the effects long before it understood the cause. Gladiators who should have fallen stood again. Slave revolts that should have collapsed grew stronger after losses. Soldiers reported unease before battles. Animals refusing to advance, fires sputtering without wind, men waking from dreams of eyes watching them from the ground. The Senate called it superstition. The generals did not. They remembered old stories. Stories Rome pretended were myths. Stories of gods that fed on suffering and repaid it with fury. Gods that did not protect empires, but punished them. That was when Rome made its mistake. It tried to erase the cult the same way it erased everything else. Raids were ordered. Tunnels collapsed. Suspected members crucified publicly as warnings. Symbols were scratched out, burned away, forbidden on pain of death. But the cult did not fade. It adapted. It stopped gathering in groups. It passed knowledge through whispered phrases, through gestures mistaken for habit. A nod, a pause before death, a look exchanged before battle. The gods did not need temples. They needed chains. And Rome provided plenty. By the time Rome realized the cult was not a religion, but a network of belief feeding something ancient, it was already too late. The old gods had tasted devotion again. And gods that awaken do not return to sleep easily. Somewhere in the shadows of the empire, a gladiator listened. A man whose name would echo through history. Spartacus had not yet joined the cult. But the cult had already noticed him. And beneath Rome the gods waited. The arena was silent before the sun rose. Sand, stained from years of blood, waited like a clock that had stopped long ago. Legions of Rome cheered for spectacle, for victory, for death. But Spartacus walked through the shadows, unnoticed by the empire that had already decided his fate. He was not yet the hero history remembers. He was a man forged in chains, tempered in pain, sharpened by the knowledge that freedom was more than a dream, it was a threat. It was in the barracks that whispers reached him first. Not the chatter of gladiators boasting about strength. Not rumors of new training or harsh masters. But voices that spoke of something older. Voices that promised power not granted by Rome, but claimed by gods Rome had buried. At first Spartacus did not believe. Men tell stories in the dark to stay sane. He had seen death enough to know, gods rarely intervene. But curiosity, dangerous curiosity, pulled him to the tunnels beneath the arena, where shadows moved against the walls and the air smelled of damp stone and ritual smoke. The circle waited. He entered alone. Torchlight flickered against the faces of the cult. Men and women whose eyes glimmered with something unnatural, scars carved into flesh in patterns that made no sense to the living. They did not speak. They watched. And he felt, for the first time, the weight of invisible eyes pressing against his soul. A voice spoke, low as if it came from the stone itself. You have survived the whip. You have survived the chains. Now you will survive what waits beneath the empire. Spartacus knelt. He did not understand the language, but the words were clear. They resonated inside him, stirring something that had lain dormant since birth. The cult offered him no choice, only endurance. A ritual began, not of blood spilled upon an altar, but of fear and memory and recognition. The walls themselves seemed to pulse. The whispers of the old gods curled around him like smoke, curling into every wound, every doubt. Spartacus felt power surge, sharp and alien. A clarity born of suffering, of chains, of survival. He understood something fundamental. Strength alone could not free a man. Belief was a weapon. Obedience to the old gods, even partial, was a shield against Rome. And then it touched him. Not a hand, not a flame, not air, but a presence. Something ancient, coiling like a shadow in his chest. It marked him, not visibly but in a way that made the blood in his veins burn. The mark was invisible, but Spartacus felt it. The old gods had claimed him, quietly, irrevocably. When the ritual ended, he stepped out of the tunnels a different man. The arena awaited, the empire expected his body to break. But now, something within him refused to bend. Something old, dark, and patient whispered, "Survive. Rise." Rome did not yet know, but the circle had found its champion, and the shadows beneath the empire were already stirring in anticipation. For Spartacus had entered the circle, and the old gods were no longer silent. The night was colder than Rome had any right to be. The moon hung low, pale and thin, as if it were a sickle suspended over the empire, ready to cut through the illusion of order. Beneath the arena, deep in the tunnels the world had forgotten, Spartacus knelt before the circle. This was no longer a secret ritual of whispers. This was a covenant, a pact between men and gods older than Rome itself. The cult moved in silence. They did not speak words meant for the living. Their chants were older, jagged, broken, and beautiful in their horror. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with life, carved symbols glowing faintly where no torch could reach. Eyes without faces, circles broken by unseen claws, lines that made the skin itch as if reality itself were bending. Spartacus was instructed to cut his palm. He obeyed, letting the blood drip into a shallow basin filled with black water. The cult did the same, each drop a promise, each drop a seal. Then the whispers began. Not the whispered language of men, but a sound older than stone. The voices of the old gods themselves, curling into the mind like smoke, curling around every doubt and fear. By blood you are bound. By chains you are freed. By pain you endure. Spartacus tasted iron in the air. It was not only his blood that marked the oath, it was the blood of every slave who had suffered before him, every life that had been erased by Rome, every scream buried beneath marble and empire. The circle watched, their eyes reflecting the dim glow of the ancient symbols. He understood, finally, why the cult existed. It was not worship. It was survival. It was resistance in a form Rome could not see or kill. Power demanded sacrifice. Freedom demanded obedience. Then came the final trial. Spartacus was led to the chamber where shadows moved with minds of their own. He faced the statues of gods Rome had tried to erase. Not kind, not forgiving. Eyes hollow, arms outstretched, mouths open in silent command. He repeated the oath aloud. Words that tasted wrong on his tongue. Words that belonged to the old earth, not to Rome. I am bound. I am witness. I am chosen. The air trembled. Something ancient, patient, and hungry shifted in the darkness. It recognized him, approved him, marked him. When the ritual ended, Spartacus rose. He was stronger, not merely in body but in purpose. The whip of Rome could break bones, chains could bend wrists, but the oath had forged something deeper, something that would never bend. Outside, the empire slept, oblivious. But below, in the shadows of the arena, the cult stirred with anticipation. The old gods had reclaimed a champion, and Rome had no idea what it had unleashed. The blood oath was more than a promise. It was a warning, because chains could be broken, empires could fall, and gods could still rise from the shadows. The empire slept, but Rome was not at peace. Legions marched, banners snapping in the wind, the sun gilding the marble of the Capitol, yet unease had begun to seep into the hearts of men. Generals awoke in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, recalling nightmares that left no sense of relief. Dreams where the earth split beneath their feet, where shadows moved independently of their owners, where eyes, dozens, hundreds of eyes, watched silently from the stone. They dismissed these visions at first. Superstition, they called it. Every empire needs superstition. But superstition does not kill horses in the stables, does it? Nor does it make soldiers collapse mid-march, screaming, pointing at shadows no one else can see. The old gods had begun to stir. It started small. Crops in the provinces rotted without reason. Grain meant to feed Rome's legions turned black overnight. Livestock refused to enter pastures. Wolves howled too close to villages, their eyes glowing with unnatural intent. The common folk whispered that the gods were angry, but the Senate silenced such talk with punishments for false rumors. Yet whispers do not die easily, and in the shadows, fear grows fast. And then the soldiers began to vanish. They were not captured. They were not wounded in battle. They simply disappeared, leaving only footprints that ended abruptly as if swallowed by the ground. The generals claimed accidents. Yet men returned from these same lands, eyes hollow, whispering of circles of fire and symbols carved into trees that could not exist. Symbols older than memory. Symbols Rome had erased long ago, but which had not forgotten humanity. Even the seas betrayed them. Supply ships vanished in calm waters. Crews reported hearing chanting beneath the waves, ancient voices promising doom. Mariners swore they saw shapes in the water, figures neither human nor animal, coiling and writhing beneath the hulls. No evidence remained for historians to record. Rome could not risk credibility. Yet the fear was real, and it spread faster than the empire's legions could march. Meanwhile, the cult thrived. Spartacus, bound to the old gods through the blood oath, began to notice changes not only in himself but in those who followed him. His fellow initiates endured wounds that would have killed any ordinary man. Some recovered with strange vigor, their senses sharper, their strength multiplied. In battle, they moved as though led by an unseen hand. Where they passed, fear lingered. Not the fear of Rome's legions, but a deeper, older fear. the instinctive knowledge that something beyond understanding was present. The first open rebellion struck in silence. No trumpet announced the uprising. No legion marched in warning. It began with a single village, slaves turning on masters, freeing the imprisoned, tearing down statues, burning fields. And in the night, shadows moved with them, shapes so dark and fast that men swore they had eyes and teeth, yet no form to call their own. Survivors spoke only in trembling whispers. The old gods walked with them, unseen but undeniably there. Rome attempted to respond. Legions were sent, strategies employed, traps set. Yet every attempt failed in ways that defied reason. Supplies rotted, arrows bent in flight, walls collapsed before soldiers could breach them. Rome's generals began to doubt themselves. Letters to the Senate grew frantic. Reports, coded and secret, spoke of unnatural phenomena, visions in the night, and men touched by something not of this world. And then came the signs in the sky, blood-red moons, shadows that moved independently of clouds, a stillness in the wind that seemed to listen. Every night, the stars seemed to rearrange themselves, forming symbols no astronomer could name. Rome called it astrology. The people whispered curses. The cult knew it as the awakening. By this time, Spartacus had become more than a leader of men. He was a conduit. The blood oath had forged him into a vessel of the old god's will. He felt their whispers constantly now, in his mind, in the rhythm of his heartbeat, in the air that clung to his skin. They were patient, they were relentless, and they demanded obedience. And yet, they granted power beyond imagining. The empire could not see them, but it could feel them. Rome's strength faltered, morale shattered, even before the first true confrontation. Soldiers began to fear shadows, generals feared visions, and the people whispered that something ancient had returned. It was not vengeance. It was remembrance. The old gods were no longer content to hide beneath stone, beneath chains, beneath history. They walked again through the bodies of men, the minds of slaves, the shadows of the empire. And every sign, the vanished men, the corrupted fields, the unnatural silence, was a warning. Rome was not merely facing rebellion. Rome was facing something older, darker, and infinitely more patient. And Spartacus, bound by blood and oath, walked at the center of it. Because to the old gods, the empire itself was a chain, and every chain was meant to be broken. The air of rebellion had grown thick, like smoke rising from countless fires, yet even the smoke could not hide the shadows that moved beneath it. Rome's legions marched, thinking they would crush a mere slave revolt. They did not know they were walking into something older, darker, and infinitely more patient. Spartacus stood at the heart of the uprising, the blood oath still burning through his veins, the whispers of the old gods never ceasing. Every victory was a testament not to mere strategy, but to forces unseen. The gods were with them, silent and vigilant, yet their guidance came with a cost. The first sacrifice came quietly. Not on a battlefield, not before the cheering or the watching eyes of the people, but in the tunnels beneath a ruined villa, where the cult had gathered in secrecy. A slave had disobeyed an order. The punishment was not Rome's whip, not the sword, it was something older. The old gods demanded acknowledgement of their power, a reminder that freedom carried consequences as sharp as any blade. Spartacus watched, understanding but unwilling. His chest tightened. The price of survival was beginning to show itself. To lead, he had to witness acts no man should, acts that etched themselves into memory with a permanence beyond pain. Yet he understood that these were not cruel acts of men. They were decrees of something beyond man, a justice older than the empire itself. The cult demanded loyalty, yes, but also blood. Not random blood. Blood from those willing to serve the old gods entirely, to bind themselves with the weight of belief. Those who resisted were removed. Their absence left a silence heavier than chains, a void that reminded the living that the gods had power not even Rome could touch. Spartacus began to question the boundaries of this power. Could freedom truly be won if it required obedience to something unknown? Could the chains of Rome be broken only to forge new chains, invisible, eternal, and unyielding? Yet, as the questions tore at him, the old gods whispered answers. Strength, survival, vengeance. They offered clarity, but the clarity was sharp, like a blade cutting through doubt, and leaving behind a wound no man could heal. The battles continued. Cities fell. Slaves rose from the shadows, moving like shadows themselves, carrying fear as a weapon sharper than any sword. But every victory came with loss. Some initiates of the cult vanished entirely, consumed, or perhaps chosen by the gods. Others returned changed, their eyes glowing with knowledge Spartacus could not fully comprehend. The world itself seemed to recognize the debt of freedom. Rivers ran red with the blood of the oppressors. Fields burned without flame. The wind carried whispers, soft, terrifying, warning those who dared defy what was ancient and patient. Spartacus understood then that leadership was no longer measured in victories or strategy. It was measured in sacrifice. In knowing when to give life, when to take it, and when to surrender pieces of oneself to powers that were neither kind nor fair. Freedom was a price paid in blood, fear, and devotion. Every chain broken carried a shadow of consequence. Every victory was marked with a weight no sword could lift. The cult pressed him onward, deeper into rituals the empire would never understand. Night after night, chants of the old gods filled the tunnels, echoing like the heartbeat of something ancient. Symbols glowed faintly in the darkness. Eyes watched. Hands unseen traced paths on the walls. The oath had tied Spartacus to something greater than Rome, and something infinitely older. And in the silence between the chants, Spartacus felt it, the awareness that Rome was not the only power to fear. The old gods were patient. They were relentless. And their demands were not negotiable. Freedom, he realized, was never free. It came at the cost of obedience, at the cost of innocence, at the cost of pieces of the soul no man could reclaim. Yet, despite the fear, despite the price, Spartacus marched onward. Because chains could still be broken. Because empires could still fall. And because the old gods had chosen him, whether he welcomed them or not. The world above Rome remained ignorant. The empire slept. But below, in the shadows, the cost of freedom was counting its toll. And every drop of blood paid would echo through eternity. The cult that Rome had never known was no longer merely a secret. It was a force of power, devotion, and fear. But even in shadows, even among those bound by blood and oath, ambition finds a way to twist the strongest of wills. It began quietly. A whisper, barely audible above the chants of the old gods. A look exchanged in the tunnels. A subtle hesitation at the rituals. Some followers had grown hungry, not for freedom but for power. The blood oath had awakened strength in them, and with strength came desire. They began to question leadership. They began to question Spartacus. Not openly, of course. Open dissent would mean death or worse. No, this was a betrayal of the subtle kind. Small acts, deliberate omissions, gestures misinterpreted as accident. And the gods noticed. Symbols carved into walls shifted slightly overnight. Shadows lingered longer in some corridors. The air grew heavier in places where the betrayers lingered. The cult, once unified by shared devotion, began to fracture. Some sought freedom, true liberation from Rome's chains. Others sought to harness the gods' power for themselves, willing to sacrifice anything or anyone to achieve it. Spartacus felt it before he understood it. A chill where warmth should have been. A whisper behind his mind where silence should have ruled. One of his closest followers, a man who had sworn the blood oath with him, now lingered too long near the symbols, staring as though listening to commands Spartacus could not hear. The first act of betrayal came during a ritual intended to fortify their strength. The cult gathered in the central chamber, symbols glowing faintly, chants vibrating through stone. A fire burned in the center, reflecting faces twisted in devotion. One of the initiates, the betrayer, stepped forward under the guise of offering his devotion, but instead tampered with the symbols, altering the flow of the ritual. The result was immediate. The shadows that had once remained obedient, moving only as the cult desired, became restless. Figures flickered at the edge of vision. Whispers turned to screams inside the minds of those present. Pain shot through the initiates' bodies without visible cause. The betrayer collapsed, convulsing as unseen hands seemed to claw at his flesh. And then the old gods revealed their judgment. One figure, taller than any man, its form flickering between shadow and substance, stepped from the darkness. Eyes like burning coals fixed on the betrayer. The air itself seemed to resist movement. It spoke without sound, yet every mind heard it. A voice that pressed into memory, that twisted the perception of reality. You have forgotten the oath. You have twisted the purpose. You will pay. The betrayer's screams echoed, then vanished. Only a symbol burned into the stone remained, a warning. The old gods do not forgive lightly. Spartacus knelt, heart pounding, understanding at last that the cult was not merely a weapon against Rome. It was a crucible. Loyalty, obedience, and faith were tested constantly. Fail and you were consumed, not by men but by something far older. Yet even amidst the terror, Spartacus knew that betrayal would not end with punishment alone. It would spread, seed doubt, and force him to confront the limits of his own power. Some among the cult still sought freedom, still sought justice. Others had already begun to plot, seeking dominion over the very gods who had granted them strength. The fractures ran deeper than he had feared. And one truth became clear: the rebellion against Rome could succeed only if the cult survived itself. The shadows in the corners of the chamber shifted again, as if aware of the tension, as if sensing the precarious balance between obedience and ambition. The old gods did not intervene yet. They waited, patience eternal, eyes watching, waiting for the next failure. And Spartacus understood fully that leadership within the cult required more than courage, strength, or strategy. It required vigilance against forces seen and unseen, against followers who might become enemies, and against the very gods whose power they had pledged to serve. Betrayal was not the end, it was only the beginning. And in the depths of the empire, where Rome's banners fluttered and soldiers slept, the shadows whispered, "Even the chosen can fall." The world above Rome still believed in order. Soldiers marched, banners waved, and the empire's heart beat with confidence. But below, in the shadows, the balance had shifted. The cult had grown strong, and Spartacus had risen as its champion. Yet even the strongest cannot predict the intentions of gods older than memory. The first sign came quietly. A scout returned from the northern provinces, eyes wide, limbs trembling, speechless for hours. He had seen the sky darken in unnatural patterns, rivers boiling in places untouched, and a herd of oxen vanish without trace. He tried to describe it, but the words failed him. The old gods were turning. Not against the cult, not yet, but against the hubris of men who thought themselves capable of commanding forces older than empires. Their power had grown too fast, their victories too certain. What had begun as a tool for survival now threatened the natural and supernatural order. The first casualties were subtle. Shadows shifted where they should not. Fires ignited and died without cause. Weapons failed in the midst of battle. Cult members, once resilient and unflinching, began to falter. Some lost control of their own strength, collapsing mid-fight. Others vanished entirely as though swallowed by the earth itself. Spartacus felt it before anyone else. A presence, vast and unyielding, pressed into his mind like the weight of stone. The whispers of the gods, once a guiding force, now hissed warnings he could not ignore. Something was coming, a reckoning. The rebellion faltered. Legions that should have been defeated found moments of uncanny luck. Traps laid by the cult failed. Supplies vanished. The ground itself betrayed them, opening into pits, collapsing tunnels, revealing that the world they had thought under their control was not theirs to command. The gods were no longer silent observers. They were judges, enforcers, wrathful and absolute. The cult tried to adapt. Spartacus rallied his followers, urging them forward, reminding them of the blood oath, the sacrifices, the promise of freedom. But nothing could withstand the turn of entities older than Rome itself. Rituals that once strengthened the initiates now became trials. Symbols glowed violently, burning into the skin of those who dared to touch them. Whispers became screams inside their minds, voices demanding obedience beyond comprehension. Every failure was punished with pain, fear, and sometimes death. Even Spartacus was not spared. He felt the power of the old gods pressing against him, testing him. Every decision, every command, every moment of pride risked provoking their ire. His victories, once guided by divine favor, now seemed fragile. One misstep could undo everything. Rome noticed too. Reports trickled in. Villages liberated by the cult were burned to the ground overnight. Entire units of soldiers claimed that the rebels had vanished into mist, leaving only the echoes of screams and symbols carved into the soil. Historians would later call it legend. Survivors whispered curses. The gods were no longer allies. They were forces of reckoning, shaping the rebellion to their inscrutable design. Some cult members whispered that the old gods had turned not against Rome, but against the mortals who dared to wield them. Their power was not a gift. It was a test, a knife in the dark, and the blade had now swung. Fear spread through the ranks. Suspicion poisoned loyalty. Men who had once bled for the cause looked over their shoulders. Some fled, some resisted, and those who remained trembled, knowing that survival depended not on courage alone, but on understanding the whims of entities that did not reason as humans did. Spartacus realized a truth colder than any winter. The gods were not merely observers, they were arbiters, and the turn of the gods was absolute. By the end of the night, the rebellion was fractured. Tunnels collapsed, cult members scattered, and the symbols of the old gods burned bright and angry in the darkness. Rome, oblivious to the cosmic terror above its head, celebrated minor victories. But the survivors of the cult knew the truth. The gods were no longer allies. They were waiting. And when the old gods turn, even the chosen are at risk. Because divine wrath does not distinguish between loyalty and ambition. It only demands obedience or destruction. Rome celebrated. Triumphant banners fluttered in the wind. Soldiers drank, generals boasted, and the Senate recorded victories as if the rebellion had never threatened the empire at all. History itself was rewritten in their image. Spartacus was gone from the pages of Rome. The cult, erased, scattered, and whispered of only in the shadows of memory. But history, no matter how heavily rewritten, cannot erase truth entirely. Those who survived the rebellion returned changed. Eyes haunted, hands trembling, voices carrying secrets they would never speak aloud. Symbols of the old gods remained etched in hidden walls, in tunnels no map could chart, in scars invisible to the untrained eye. Rome believed it had won. Rome believed it had silenced the whispers. Yet the old gods do not sleep. They never have. Beneath the empire, in darkened tunnels and forgotten ruins, the symbols glowed faintly, waiting. The air still carried whispers, soft but insistent, curling around the minds of those sensitive enough to hear them. The chains that had bound humanity had been broken, but the debts owed to the gods had not been forgotten. Spartacus, the champion, was a ghost in the memory of men. But in the eyes of the old gods, he was immortal. The blood oath, the sacrifices, the devotion, it had not ended. It could not end. Legends spoke of him as a hero, a rebel, a man who challenged Rome and fell. But the truth, the hidden truth, was darker. He had entered the circle. He had been marked by the old gods. And those gods, patient and eternal, had not abandoned him. The cult had been scattered, its members hunted, and the empire's chains restored. Yet in every shadow, in every whisper carried by wind or river or flame, the presence of the old gods lingered, watching, waiting, remembering. History buried the rebellion, the cult, the gods. But the gods buried nothing. And somewhere, beneath the ruins of empires, beneath the weight of centuries, the old gods still waited. Because empires rise and fall. Men die. Chains break. But the old gods endure. And one day, when the world is ready, or when it is least expecting, they will awaken again. The whispers will return. The shadows will move. And history will remember.